Change. Do you seek it, enact it, resist, or accept it? Or do you view it as an opportunity to be seen, take a stand, say that you believe? Change has the power to elevate, realizing the potential of the next generation.
Something from American University, kid. Yay!
Elevate, opening doors, expanding horizons. Elevate. Champions of a more inclusive world. Change. It's the chance to inspire. With knowledge transformed into impact.
The goal of our research on the brain is to improve human health and well-being and the quality of life.
Inspire game-changing new discoveries.
I believe that our work in responsible artificial intelligence will contribute to address structural bias.
Inspire advancements that transform our world and shift our worldview.
Extremely is a podcast for anyone who wants to understand and interrupt modern hate and extremism.
Inspire change, because change is an opportunity to lead, breaking down barriers by opening eyes and ears.
What are the causes and consequences of delaying healthcare?
Lead, forging connections, finding common ground.
Walk in someone else's shoes and try to understand life from their perspective.
Lead, building better communities.
You can't just assume someone else is just going to do it. You need to be there for your community.
Lead, committed to a new way forward. Changemakers for a changing world. Take the lead by leading the way.
I use my AU experience to change communities.
Say yes to every opportunity.
Be unstoppable and be determined.
Change. It's your opportunity, because we know change can't wait.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's virtual coffee chat hosted by the American University's Women's Network. My name is Alexa Pappas, and I'm a graduate of the School of Public Affairs. I have the pleasure of serving alongside my fellow Eagle alumna Jolene McNeil as the current co-chairs of AU's Women's Network. Sadly, Jolene is under the weather today, so I'll be doing the honors. The Women's Network seeks to bring together AU alumni to connect, build, and strengthen valuable relationships that will contribute to professional success, as well as deepen ties to the AU community. Events like our coffee chats and our signature Women in Leadership breakfast create opportunities for AU women to connect, re-engage, and empower women across our community. Jolene and I look forward to hosting candid dialogues about issues and topics that are important and of interest to you guys, and we are starting with that today. This afternoon, we are fortunate to spotlight AU women who are truly global change makers. This community conversation will be moderated by AU alumna and Executive Director of American University's Sign Institute for Policy and Politics, Amy Dacey. The conversation features AU's School of International Service alumna, Danica Starks, and SIS Professor Ambassador Piper Campbell. Together, they will help to raise awareness about the Ukrainian-Russian crisis and pathways for peace and conflict resolution. As we participate in the conversation today, we welcome you to share your comments and ask questions using the Q&A or chat function, as we will facilitate a community Q&A at the close of the discussion. With those introductory remarks out of the way, I would like to introduce our moderator, Amy Dacey. Similar to Jolene and I, Amy is a graduate of AU's School of Public Affairs, and today serves, as I mentioned, as the Executive Director of AU's Sign Institute. Amy's career in politics and public policy spans over 2 decades and includes appointments and positions that wide-eyed AU freshmen can only dream of. Amy knows precisely how the sausage is made, as they say, and we are so very fortunate that she is able to help lead our conversation today. And with that, I turn it over to Amy.
Well, Alexa, thank you so very much. I thank you for opening the program and all the work that you're doing for the Women's Network. Jolene, we're sending you our very best and look forward to having you join us, certainly at the next event in the near future. A huge thanks to the Women's Network for putting this event together and the entire team that worked so hard to bring this to you today. It is my honor, first and foremost, to introduce you to the women who are going to share their expertise with us today. I start with Ambassador Piper Campbell, who is an adjunct professorial lecturer at American University and CEO of Campbell Wind LLC. Ambassador Campbell teaches graduate courses on the history of global politics, the U.S.-China relationship, and Indo-Pacific security. She is on the advisory committee of the Meridian Center for Diplomatic Engagement and is chair of the nonpartisan organization Women Ambassadors Serving America. Having served as the head of the U.S. mission to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in 2018 and ambassador to Mongolia from 2012 to 2015. Ambassador Campbell's areas of expertise include East Asia and navigating multilateral organizations, including the UN system. The other person who is joining us today is Danica Starks. Danica is the senior U.S. commercial liaison and advisor to the U.S. executive director at the World Bank and head of the Commerce Department's Multilateral Development Bank Group. Danica has over 20 years of experience in international economic policy, commercial diplomacy, trade, and national security, with a specialization in Europe and Eurasia. Most recently, Danica served as the director of the policy team at the U.S. Department of Commerce in the Office of Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. And among her many community interests, Danica is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. She is the Prince George's County lead for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America and serves on the board of EMIC, Engaging Minorities in International Cultures. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us today. So much in those bios, such incredible wealth of experience that will lend to the conversation today. But I have to ask, is there something I didn't mention that you'd like to share with the community? And maybe I'll start with you, Ambassador, and see, and then what I just shared, what didn't I share that you'd love us to know?
Well, first and foremost, Amy, please call me Piper. And I'm so honored to be here alongside Danica, who has such an impressive resume, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. I guess I would say two things of relevance. First, on the AU front, I'm really proud to announce that I'm going to be stepping into a increased role at American University starting this summer as the director of the SIS Foreign Policy and Global Governance programs. So I'm sure that we have some alumna from those programs, and I really look forward to connecting more with the school and the alumni as I move into that position. Then the second, which I think is relevant for this conversation, as a career diplomat, I served in the Foreign Service for 30 years, but somewhat unusually, I was loaned to the United Nations. And so I was part of a UN peacekeeping operation. So I've had sort of the on-the-ground perspective of what it means for people to be in a situation like this sorts of situation that we're seeing today in the Ukraine. And I think that really shapes my thinking about how women are involved in situations of conflict, not only as victims, but also as drivers of change. And we're going to be talking about change making today. And I look forward to that part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Piper. And Danica, is there something I didn't mention that we should know about?
Well, of course, it's kind of obvious because I didn't change my background. I'm a Trekkie. So it's actually a very big part of my self-care and the fun, nerdy part of me. It's not sort of announced overly publicly yet, but it's pretty much a done deal. But I will be teaching for the Syracuse Maxwell School for Public Affairs this fall. Their Washington, D.C. program. I'm going to teach a course on economic statecraft. So I'm very excited about that. And then I also run a mentoring program for people interested in careers in international affairs, whether you're early career, college, or even, mid-career looking to change. It's called Monthly Mentoring Mondays. There's a group on LinkedIn that you can join. And we do monthly meetings introducing you to people for the public sector and the government, basically trying to help people to understand how you really get a job and keep a job and what it's really like to work at these various organizations, things that you can't find on a website. So sort of, group mentoring around the field and trying to connect people. So but some people might be interested in that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll share that information with everybody for sure. And so thank you so much. You to me are both the definition of AU Changemakers. So we're so excited to have you today. I just want to remind people, please don't wait till a Q&A session. Just whenever questions arise, please put them in there so that we can get to as many questions as we can, while we're together today. But, let's jump right in. Danica, I have to say, you having served as the director of the policy team at the U.S. Department of Congress and the Office of Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, you understand the cultural landscape, the rips in history far greater than most. We are seeing it unfold now on CNN every minute, but could you maybe share with us kind of the cause of the initial conflict between Russia and Ukraine and what led to the current warfare, something we might not all be familiar with if we just turn on the TV today?
Great. So first of all, I have to give the disclaimer that I'm speaking in my personal opinion and capacity. I'm not speaking representing policy of the Biden administration or the Commerce Department. So just wanted to put that disclaimer out there. I'm giving you sort of my version. So I'm glad you said current versus the initial conflict, because unfortunately those of us who cover the region have lived through this before. And it's not just Ukraine. Also, remember that Russia invaded Georgia in August of 2008 as well. So the Slavic part of me would like to tell you that this goes back 1,000 years. And so I think one of the things that I think people need to understand is Ukraine and Russia are very much tied culturally. And I'm not trying to put any of Putin's disinformation out, but they are tied culturally. And in fact, Russia gets its name actually from technically Ukraine. That there's an area called the Kievan Rus that included modern day Ukraine, Russia, I believe modern day Belarus and some other places. And that's where actually Russia, that term, Rossiya, gets its name from that. And so there is literally a historical linkage, but in reality, it should be Ukraine invading Russia, not the other way around. It was actually, Kyiv was actually the capital of that vast territory. But I say that to say that there's 1,000 years of psychology behind this, where there is a real link in a way that as Americans, I don't think we understand, because almost all of us, except for those of us who are descendants of Native Americans, come from people who we only go back a few generations. And so I think it's very hard for us to understand the psychological link that there's a cultural there. But I would say that this conflict has been the idea of Russia trying to dominate the region around it and what it calls its near abroad has been going back obviously till from the time of the czars. So this is not new in looking at Russian history. But I think if you wanted to put a modern spin to it, it's definitely the rise of Putin. Russia was very weakened with the fall of the Soviet Union, and it really lost its place even as a regional power. And you saw, for example, the rise of China and their One Belt, One Road initiative being able to outspend Russia in terms of investments in the region. And with the rise of a strongman in Russia, I think part of the history of autocratic leaders in Russia has always been regional dominance. And I think that this literally comes down to, while there are some systemic issues, we've seen evidence that a lot of this war has really come down to an agenda that Putin has, both personally, but also because of the history that Russia has had in wanting to have dominance and wanting to sort of restore a pride and to restore their what they consider the rightful place. So the shorter version is, I would say, it's definitely, I don't know that you see this if, for example, like Medvedev or someone else had been in power. It's Putin specifically, but it's also I think any leader that leaned towards the autocratic side, you are probably going to see something like this, because it has been repeated over and over and over again in Russia's history for hundreds of years.
So multi-generations in the country have experienced this going back. This is not something just it's very, very interesting. And I think it's good to give the context. So I appreciate that. And, I have to say, Piper, for a lot of us who might watch it from TV or far away or not know the incredible background that Danica just gave us, we might ask the question, How does this Ukrainian-Russian crisis impact us in the U.S., and maybe why should we be aware of these things that are happening, and how do they affect us? Do they?
Indeed. And I think, oftentimes when trying to answer that question, how do global affairs affect us at home, people tend to focus on the negative, right? The US jobs lost to globalization, the security risks, the concerns, the way that global threats like COVID can impact us in the United States. And certainly when we think about the Ukraine situation right now, we're mostly thinking in that negative space. We're seeing the impacts of the situation in Ukraine on oil prices in the United States, on the slump in the stock market. We have a real concern about the security in Europe, including the security of institutions like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and US commitments via NATO. But and then we're talking about things like the flow of Ukrainian refugees into the United States. I'm really happy to see the United States stepping up and accepting some Ukraine refugees. But we're also seeing a tremendous flow of Ukrainian refugees into Europe, and the questions around what impact that will have on the European host countries. The other side of the answer, which I would also want to stress, is all of the positive impacts of globalization on the United States, and why I so adamantly believe that the most important thing for any AU graduate would be some understanding of the global context, is that it is inescapable in our lives today. Whether, again, we can look at the economic front, we can look at the political front, and we can look at the sociocultural front. And on any of those levels, we can see so many ways in which our lives today are intertwined with the global systems. And so we have to understand them. And that's not only people from the School of International Service, it's people across the AU spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's important to note that everybody's, will be impacted in some way. And we're seeing this, as more and more is happening, and talked about it with our leaders here in the United States and their reaction to the situation. I want to pose to both of you, we've seen women are truly leading and participating in international affairs. Amid the visuals you see and hear about throughout various news outlets, we miss the impact of conflict on women and children, and also consciously choosing not to view women as victims, but instead acknowledging how they are actively engaged in the process. And we're recognizing that story that we hear is very different from the actual narrative. I do want to bring up a point. We were fortunate enough to get together and talk a little bit before the session. And one thing that came up that seemed to be really important and we needed to focus on is shining a light on the role of information versus disinformation, in this conflict. So Danica, I want to start with you as somebody who's done so much work in this, and we hear the narrative coming out of Russia about misinformation going to, very people there, but then also, what information are we hearing from and sharing? And so what role is this playing to know what's really happening versus some of these disinformation campaigns we're seeing?
Sure. I think, first of all, I really enjoyed Piper, I keep wanting to call you ambassador, her answer. And I think I would just add that part of why we need to pay attention to this is, I think there's some great lessons learned for how we can mobilize when we want to. I'm looking at all the things that a lot of the companies and corporations have done, all these innovative things in terms of how they're sending help and other things. And I look at that and say, well, can we take some of those examples and use that in our own communities? Like, why aren't we doing that for some of our poor or distressed communities here? Like, and maybe we put some pressure that, hey, if you did it for Ukraine, you can do it for Detroit. Or, if we can get, water and other supplies to Ukraine, why can't we do that for Flint, Michigan? So that's one area that I think we need to hold accountable. So in terms of looking at women, but also in terms of disinformation and other things, I would say it's gotten better and it's gotten worse. It's gotten better in that if you know where to look, there's a lot of information out there, right? Like there's a lot of people who are on the ground, who are blogging, who are doing live feeds and videos. But if you're only looking at, for example, sort of broad news outlets, you just sort of have to believe what you see. I would say that the problem is people tend to focus on sort of one area where they get their news, and they're not sort of looking more broadly. The other issue is, for the most part, as Americans, we are not polyglots. Most people speak just English. And so most people are only looking at things through translation. So for example, when Putin did his big speech, like I think the night before the invasion or the night of the invasion, I'm watching it in English, and there's something that wasn't quite resonating. So I'm a Russian speaker, and I actually looked for the speech in Russian, and it was actually much scarier in Russian. And oh my God, it was horrible. Because Russian's a more complex language than English. There are many more ways to say things. And so the language that he chose to use was something that I just had not, it was bad. But how many people can do that, right? And so, and also how many people are going to go the extra mile to, again, follow those people on Twitter that are maybe on the ground and other things. And so I think sometimes it can be very difficult to understand the fullness of the situation. I think sometimes it's hard to understand how bad it is in some areas, but I would say that we're better off than people, for example, in Russia. And while, again, I'm not trying to put all the blame on Putin and say that the Russian people don't have certain responsibilities in terms of, who they allow to be in power, just remember that a lot of people don't have access to the kind of information that we do. It is possible in other countries to literally cut off access to the internet, to firewall off. And so we also have to be careful when we're judging the actions of a government versus judging the actions of individual people. They're not getting the same information that we are. And so again, while I'm not trying to take all responsibility off of, say, every Russian person, we have to remember that in a lot of cases, they are not getting the truth. And it's actually very easy, just like we don't speak Russian, many of them don't speak English. So they're not watching CNN and other things, if those channels can't be broadcast. And this is why it's important that we have outlets such as Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. This is why, the U.S. Information Service had been so important. Is we need to actually do, I think, a better job of broadcasting language-specific messaging throughout the world that does provide the truth. I guess the part of the problem is we're actually fighting with what that truth is here, even in America. So I think it's going to be a continuous problem. I don't know what the ultimate answer is going to be, but I do think that there are things that we can do as a government to increase that. And then as people, to take that extra responsibility to try to do that deeper dive, watch the BBC and Al Jazeera or other sources and just see how they might be reporting differently than what we report, and just to get a broader sense.
It's a really good point. I'm having a hard time too. I want to say, Ambassador Piper, what are you thinking about this challenge that we're seeing globally?
I love Danika's advice to read and watch sources that are both from outside the United States, but also from outside of where your natural inclinations may be. And I recently read about a study in the United States, which had a group of Fox News watchers who were actually paid as part of a study to watch CNN every day for a period of time. And the effort was to see if views would change based on the new sources of news that to which you can access. And it was really interesting to see the extent to which these individuals' views changed based on the information they were accessing. And I think that is so important to understand when we think about Russia, and we think about, kind of as Danica was referring to, why are the Russian people allowing what has happened? Not only are they allowing what has happened to happen, but as far as we can tell, they're significantly in support of it. And I think so much of that story is the story of the information which is most accessible to them. And the other piece of that is that so much information is available to us right now, right? We're like swimming in information. And when you're swimming in information, it's really hard to figure out which pieces to grab onto. There's one specific anecdote I wanted to share that I think kind of illustrates so much of this. There was a Chinese individual who is living right now in Ukraine, and he was blogging from Ukraine, describing the situation of what was going on, what his personal lived experience was. And at first he started to trend in China. There was a real interest in this individual story and this raw information. But then as the Chinese government started to support the Russian government and the Russian government's narrative, it was shocking to see how in the social media space, the views, the way the Chinese were receiving this Chinese individual's lived experience, they started to call him a traitor. And most of the postings in response to his blog started to be, why are you posting these things? Why are you being so unpatriotic? And the idea that for a person to describe what he is living through, that description is unpatriotic, is for me extremely worrying. That in a nutshell really flags so many of the problems and concerns.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up just as a follow-up question. We did see early on some protests in Russia. So there was some, Russian individuals who were against this. But the question is, what are the consequences? How can people use their voice in a situation where they are in Russia and you're seeing things like, even this Chinese individual, how that was changed and their narrative is changed. If you're getting information and you're against what's happening, how do you use your voice in that kind of thing? You've seen this regionally, you are experts in the region. Like, how does somebody who thinks against what's happening in their own country, what could they do? I don't know who wants to take that one. I don't know. Danica, from just
I mean, I don't want to then later be accused of fomenting, revolution in Russia or any place. But I'll take a stab. I'm not an expert in transition. I actually have my best friend is an expert in political transition. Mm-hmm. But if you look at, for example, what happened in Kazakhstan, actually this past September, when the government raised oil and gas prices, like out of nowhere, seemingly, even for people like me who watch fairly carefully, you saw these tremendous protests come up almost overnight, and not just in one city, but across the country. It was done on local sort of social media. So it wasn't on like sort of the major platforms. It was these local social media outlets and whatnot. And while what I was told is that later part of the way the government was able to shut them down is by, again, banning internet and things. But it was so bad that because the internet was down, the Kazakhstan Ministry of Foreign Affairs was actually having to hand walk statements to various embassies in the capital because they too couldn't use the internet. But so local social media, getting the word out, sharing information, those people who do have channels being able to share information, and local grassroots organization is throughout history. I mean, is what we've seen. I think it'll also, in the case of Russia, because of the nature of some of the violence that happens, it's going to take some mid-level leadership also being willing to stand up. It's going to take some regional governors, unfortunately, most of whom are directly appointed by Putin, but it's going to take some regional leaders and others to really get behind the public protests who are willing to actually stop the violence by the police. Right. And I think, look at the same thing in the United States. Look what happened after, George Floyd and whatnot. You need regional leadership that's willing to allow people to have their voice. And so I think in addition to sort of the groundswell among the public, there needs to be a few regional leaders, especially in a country as big as Russia. There are 9 time zones in Russia. You know what I mean? It takes longer to fly across Russia than it does to fly across the United States. So you're going to need some powerful regional leaders. It can't just be something that happens in Moscow. But again, not an expert, but that's just based on somebody who's traveled extensively throughout Russia. It's not going to be something where it's just going to start in St. Petersburg and naturally just spread. There's really going to have to be sort of a resistance that is supported by some regional leaders across the country. And I can't say that I know to the extent at which that's even a possibility right now.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really problematic and important to stress is to the extent that we know about Russian popular opinion, how much support there is for Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. We get things like somewhat state-sponsored polling, which shows an uptick in Vladimir Putin's approval rating among Russians of above 70% approval rating. But we can be somewhat skeptical of that. But I know that just in the last couple of weeks, there have been some independent and pretty credible polling of Russian public opinions. And the reports come out as more than that, like 58, 62% of Russians continuing to be in support of the government's actions in the Ukraine. And so I think we need to be, really thoughtful and be careful not to say this is all Putin, but to go back to and really focus on some of the things, for example, that Danica was saying in the beginning, that this negative Russian obsession with Ukraine runs deep and has been long term. And Danica referred to that 1,000-year Slavic history. And I served previously, I worked in the Balkans after the Balkan War, and I find myself really concerned and bothered by, for example, the Serbian reaction to what is going on in Ukraine. I saw just today a photograph from a football game, and the Serbian fans were holding a flag which is a flag which flags, pun intended, support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And just sort of trying to understand, again, these cultural connections, the Slavic cultural connections, the stories and history that they tell themselves, and not to fool ourselves that the solution to this situation is easy or short-term.
Yeah, and on that, I really wanted to flag just how big Russia is as a country, even just geographically. There are places that are extremely isolated, but that have huge populations of people. So yeah, even if you had 50% of people who were against the war in Ukraine, that the kind of mobilization that you'd need in a country like that would still require quite a bit of leadership that just isn't there right now. So it's not something that just a few people can do easily. And the other thing that I would say is even some of the people, and I'm not going to name any names, but even some of the people who are anti-Putin are still Russian nationalists. So just because you get, that's what I said. Like, while yes, Putin is the current leader and he's bears a lot of responsibility for this, it's not like he's the only Russian leader who has a sense that there is this sort of Russian leadership that is necessary for this sort of Slavic group. And Piper, your reference to the Balkans gave me chills, because you're right, Serbia is definitely worth watching. My name is actually from that region. Danica means the morning star. There used to be a newspaper in Serbia called Danica, actually. And yeah, it's the same thing there, where these histories go deep in a way that I think as Americans, we don't understand as well, because we traditionally are from people, for whether through slavery, immigration, or the things that have been mobile and have had to adapt. And I don't think that we sometimes sort of understand just how far back people's memories go in other parts of the world.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you sharing like the geography, because I think sometimes in our heads we think of Russia as Moscow, St. Petersburg, but like the fact that some of us don't even realize how large this country is that you've traversed, and just how far it is from place to place there, and within the country, the diversity there. I would say, please, people, there is plenty of time to ask deeper questions. If you want to know more information about what's happening in the area, I encourage you to go to the Q&A and do that. I want to pivot for just a moment, because we also, as a part of the Women's Network, have this opportunity to talk about two experts in their field. So if you don't mind, I also want to talk a little bit about your careers and your experiences. I think, as women, and also considering the varying intersections of identity, it can be an interesting and probably a quite challenging to navigate careers in the national security space, particularly on the international stage. So I was wondering if, while we have you, one of the questions I'm really curious about is, what challenges have you faced and how have you worked to overcome them in this field? And maybe, Piper, we'll start with you. I'm very curious to know your experiences.
Well, there certainly are many challenges, but one of the weirdly pieces of good news is that I find fewer of the challenges these days are gender-based. So I often get the question, what is it like to be a woman in the Foreign Service? And I try to redirect that to what is it like to be in the Foreign Service, recognizing that every person has their own experience. And many of the challenges about, a two-spouse household, or the necessity of moving every couple of years, what do you do with your children, all those sorts of things. Those are issues for families, not just for women. And I think as we've seen more women enter the Foreign Service with male spouses, the sort of some of those questions around how does your spouse find work? How does your spouse find meaning? And especially as an ambassador, I mean, there's so many absurd things in terms of, expectations of, it used to be that ambassadors were men, their spouses were women, their spouses didn't work, but had a full-time job in the support of the ambassador's representational role. And I arrived in Mongolia as a single individual and a woman, and so had to figure out how to be the ambassador and my own spouse, so performing both of those roles. But so there are challenges, but on the other hand, there's also incredible opportunities. And sometimes I have found my gender to be, for two things I'd say. The first is sometimes I've found my gender to be quite helpful, and most notably in conflict situations. So both when I served in the Balkans in the peacekeeping operation and when I was the consul general in Iraq, I was able to have conversations with men and women. And I'm a quite direct speaker, but I think that at times, including, I remember a couple instances where in the Balkans where I was basically walking into a house and telling a man with a gun in that house who was occupying a house that was not his, that it was time for him to leave. And I think that were I a man, just by normal gender roles, that conversation would have had a harder edge. The same in Iraq. I had access to women in Iraq that a male counterpart wouldn't have had. And so back to that, touching on women, not only as victims, but as change makers in these situations, my ability to speak with women, but also my ability to speak with men in a somewhat different way. Those have all been tremendous assets. I have also so enjoyed traveling overseas bringing my daughter with me on my overseas postings. And whether it's through her perspectives on life in the Foreign Service or through the people she meets and the connections that you're able to make by being present as a family, as opposed to just as an individual. Those are all some very special things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to hear some of the opportunities that you mentioned too. Danica, what about you? I'm also curious for both of you, what brought you to this field? If there was any one singular moment or something that, also got you interested in pursuing this. But Danica?
Oh, Piper, did you want to answer that second part first? What brought you to the field?
I stumbled into it, so that would be the short answer. When I was an undergraduate, and people asked me what I was going to do with a degree from the School of Foreign Service, I said I didn't know, but I wasn't going to work for the government. And 32 years later, I still don't know, what that motivation was. Except I do think that the U.S. government, the federal government, needs to tell a better story, and it's a continuing challenge. We need to tell a better story about what it is to serve.
So I guess I'll go. I would say first, I relate to what Piper was saying about having to be herself and a spouse. I had a single female boss, boss's boss, who just happened to give me a ride home from an event one day. And, I was maybe 25 years old. And she said, Danica, people are going to tell you throughout your career that you need a husband, but what you really need is a wife. And I totally, and she meant and I don't think everybody understands the joke, right? I'm not going to go over explain, but it's so true, right? Like there, a lot of things are set up thinking that there is a man and then a woman helps. In terms of, what you were saying about gender, it's so hard for me to isolate what's gender on the good and the bad side. I actually just did a talk for a women's networking group called Chief that I belong to, and it was about international women in international affairs, and there's a lot of international women who are working in the U.S. and one of the things that I was explaining to them is that in the US, so much of our social and professional and other lives are dominated by race, that it tends to trump gender in so many areas. And quite frankly, a lot of the issues that I have, I've experienced from women too. It wasn't, specifically white women, mostly because there haven't been that many other Black women, to be honest. I mean, maybe they would be just as hard, but there just haven't been enough of them to make a difference. Some of the worst not just confrontations, but what now we would call not even just microaggressions, but macroaggressions, telling me what I should be doing with my hair. There's Crown Acts being passed, but I remember having that same female, leader coming up to me one day. My hair was, sort of pulled back and in a ponytail, and I had a relaxer, so my hair had been chemically straightened. And she was like, you shouldn't wear your hair like that because it's too tight on your hair and it's to get it that straight and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like it's chemically straight. And why would you care? Like, I just can't imagine somebody going up to a non-Black woman thinking that they can tell them what they should be doing to their hair. And just the fact that hair is such a big deal in terms of, I had I don't want to out her, but let's just say a young Black woman who's in the Foreign Service now, who's in a region that I used to cover, called me. She had just done her hair in braids, and she called me to say, is it okay if I go out like this in this country and at the embassy? Before I do anything more, I gotta take it out. You've been at it longer. And I said, I think you're fine. But I mean, how many white women have ever had to call a mentor and say, does my hair look okay for the embassy? And not even just the whole country that they're in, but like, how are my fellow colleagues going to see this if I come in braids? And this is to a woman who's living outside of the country, who doesn't have that many options for what she can do with her hair. And I don't mean to just belittle that, but hair is one of those examples. It's a real issue, right? I remember I went when I was going to National Defense University, and I had one of my female leaders who I got along very well with. This person was not problematic that I knew of. And I went to go say goodbye. And this person is now in a very, very senior position, so I have to be careful. But I sat there and she literally said to me, Danica, I remember the first time that I looked at you and didn't see a Black person, but I saw a professional and somebody who really knows their job and is well-spoken. And I just sat there and I did not know what to say, because she could not see me as a professional. She could not see me as an equal until she saw past my Blackness. And it really hurt, because I don't want to have to not be Black in order to be a professional. I want to. I want to be able to bring my full self and all of my experiences. I can go down the list of how many times I've had things like that happen. And to say that it wasn't a gender-based thing. Mm-hmm. What I will say though, in terms of how it's been helpful, and I see a couple of people on the line, friends of mine from the Eurasia region, is while dealing with, I would say, countries like, say, Russia, there's a lot of racism, including anti-Blackness, anti-Africanness. And I believe me, had my share of things living in Moscow, being spit on and other things. And I remember the first time I started traveling to Central Asia and the Caucasus, so going to places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia. It was such a world of difference. I got treated like a queen. And it was because, as I began to find out that even though I was an American, people understood enough about American dynamics that they knew what the challenge would have been like as an American minority. And a lot of them had had that same experience in the Soviet Union, or even in going to Russia, where Armenians and other people are discriminated against, that they related. And so what I found is often I would go to the State Department for a big meeting, and my fellow Americans would sort of give me the look like, oh, can I have some coffee? Why are you here? But the people on the other side, like the Uzbeks and others, immediately took me seriously, because in their case, instead of people looking like, how did you get in the room? They're like, well, if you're Black and you got in the room, you must be smart or you must be important. And so I actually found that I actually had an affinity for working with the Caucasus and Central Asia, specifically because of my status as a minority, because I brought a different view of America. I had an ambassador from the region reach out to me during the George Floyd incident and the protest, saying, I understand this more than I think you know. We too understand what it's like to be beaten down by the government and police, and I lived through this in my childhood. So it's I wouldn't trade it. Like, I wouldn't, what they say, I wouldn't trade my journey. I don't want to be anybody other than who I am. I was made perfectly the way I am. So I don't want to not be Black or whatever. But I will say that it is something that anybody that is looking into this field who is of color, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be hard. I would say mentors are key. Having some people who can help you navigate, help you to understand which are the situations to make a big deal of, which are the ones that you're going to have to let go. But those mentors don't all need to be Black or Hispanic or Asian. Having, some older white men as mentors who can help sort of navigate, who can speak for you, not being afraid to use your allies. And what I have found is, while there have been some not so great people, there have also been some wonderful allies. And in the case of AU, Nanette Levinson, who was the associate dean of the School of International Service when I went, was like the Jewish mother I never had at AU. And it's a long story, but she looked out for me and made sure I was treated well. She called professors to tell them, hey, this is a really smart person you're getting, look out for her. And so that's important. And so I also encourage those people who are on the call who are more professional, don't be afraid to do that for others. Help set the stage for them. So it's a mixed bag, but at the same time, I wouldn't change who I am. But what I am trying to do is change the field so that the people coming after me don't have to deal with some of the same things that I did. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but
no, I think it's
a big passion of mine is diversifying our foreign affairs establishment. So
God, and I so appreciate you sharing that and sharing the journey, which is, I think, important. Not only you experts in your field, but your experiences are, I think, really important for everybody that's joining us today. While you were sharing your personal journeys, we had some questions from the audience that I want to share with you. The first one comes from Amy Peterson, and she said, "Thank you so much for this conversation. Danica mentioned the role of corporations in the response. I'm interested in your thoughts on the sustainability of the robust private response and the impact of the focus on Ukraine on the availability of funding to address other conflicts." Thank you, Amy, for sharing that. I know, Danica, you had mentioned the role of corporations. Do you have a response for Amy on some of her inquiry here?
Yeah, I think a lot of it just depends. So first of all, I have to give a shout out to the Ukrainian government. I have never seen the Ukrainian government function this high functioning before in my years working with Ukraine. And the Ukrainian government, Zelensky and some of the other ministers have done an incredible job of actually doing some targeted outreach. Like, their minister of communications, got to Elon Musk on Twitter, asking for a Starlink connection. And they've done a really good job of being very specific, like, we need this, 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 and this. And so they've made it as easy as possible. I would say the fact that Ukraine is in Europe makes a big difference. We've seen some of the coverage about how people seem to care more about, it being a European, quote unquote, civilized place. So I think that even if there was another, I've never seen this kind of outpouring for a lot of things going on in Africa or other places. I mean, I'm just going to put that out there. So I think part of there is an interest from that side. And then I will say that even if the private sector interest wanes directly, so as somebody who's at the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IMF and others, they're going to be pouring money into Ukraine. The commitments are already there, and companies will also be able to, I don't want to say take advantage, but these banks rely on companies to bid on projects to actually get the things done. So the reconstruction of Ukraine is going to be a major thing, and you're going to see a lot of companies wanting to go in and get some of that work, to be honest, doing the rebuilding. But I do think it's the cause du jour. I cannot say what would happen if something erupted in Serbia or other places, but I haven't seen anything quite like the outpouring here in a while. And so I do think that it's going to be sustained for longer than usually happens. The fact that people are still interested this much, even after this has been going on for a couple of months, is still actually quite astonishing.
Yeah, it's stressful and disappointing to see. It's wonderful to see the response for Ukraine. It is stressful and disappointing that we don't see that same sort of response. We don't see the same sort of attention and caring and identification with what's going on in Yemen, the continuing crisis in Ethiopia. And so I think for anybody in the field, the reality of this difference in level of response and attention is frustrating. But I'm always sort of trying to channel that frustration into something more positive. And I would go back to something that Danica said earlier, which is I think every time that we get, for example, corporations taking the kinds of actions that they have in Ukraine, it's a new precedent. And what we need to try to do is to say, hey, you did that in Ukraine and it's amazing and it was impactful. Can you do that same sort of thing in these other international crises? And just like Danica was saying, hey, you did that in Ukraine. What about bringing those same sort of corporate social responsibility, that momentum back to the United States and to needs here? And so trying to use these awful situations to raise the bar and to keep the bar high and to raise our expectations of what individuals should care about, what corporations should do, as well as what the government needs to do.
It's hard to believe time has flown by so fast. I know that we could be with you both for hours longer because there is so much complexity to these issues. I do have one final question from the audience I'd like to share with both of you, and it's from Pamela H. She certainly wanted to thank you both for your knowledge and your insight. She must go back to the Russian people here. Given your descriptions of deep socio-cultural history layered with the massive size of the regions, what would you say are the incentives that are strong enough to build a critical mass of Russians that can position themselves to resist aspects of the invasion that they might not agree with? Piper, do you want to start maybe with that one? Or
I think of three things. And I love Danica mentioned that her name, Danica, is of Serbian origin. And in fact, my landlady, when I was living in a Serb-controlled part of Croatia, my landlady's name was Danica, which made me think back to one of the sort of glory days of the Serbian resistance was when the Serbian people really pushed out Milosevic. And part of that story is that discontent grew over time to a point where there was such a depth of public discontent, and people would come out every night. Danica probably remembers this, and they would bang pots. Then literally in the early evening, more and more people would just open their windows and bang pots. It was this noise, this cacophony that got louder and louder and more impactful, and really scared those mid-level leaders that Danica was mentioning before, and made them realize they needed to stop their support for Milosevic and abandon that support for Milosevic in order to save their own skin. And so what I'm thinking about in terms of Russia is, I mean, realistically, I do not think it should be anybody's strategy to try to take on Putin directly. But I think a strategy of finding those cracks and finding the ways to get more information into Russians, but also to, unfortunately, to make the Russian people pay for Russia's actions. Because I think that it's got to hurt. It's got to hurt their wallets. It's got to hurt their comfort. And when they start to feel uncomfortable and they start to feel unhappy about what they're experiencing, that's what's going to shift them into an active role, is my kind of pessimistic take.
Danica, what would you add to that?
Yeah, actually, it's funny. Piper's going to make me a better person because she always goes for the optimistic parts. I don't have to hang out. Because I was actually going to go straight for that sort of last part, not sanctions and just in the economic sense, because I think your average Russian, wasn't like, on the London Stock Exchange, right? So the sanctions are for the Putin cronies, they're for the big corporations, that type of thing. Now, there are some Russians that got caught like in their resort in Turkey and their credit card didn't work, blah, 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 blah. But it's these non-traditional sanctions that have been very interesting because they're not controlled by any particular government. And so you can't blame it on America or whatever. So like, FIFA, nobody wanting to play the Russians and the Russians not being able to play in the World Cup. No more Russians on the Olympics, not even under like Russian Olympic Committee, like, scratch that, no Russians in the Olympic. These are the things that Russian people care about. And Europeans in general, I would say, no Russians at Eurovision, you know what I mean? But you really have to make it unpopular to be Russian outside of Russia. And guess what? Not to demean Russia, but they, because of the history of the Soviet Union, the things, they really have looked to the outside and like participating in these big international events as a show of strength, power, but also I would say, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of Russians do want to be part of that bigger world. And to just completely be closed off and all you have is Putin and your fake brie, because you can't get, brie from France, it's going to get pretty miserable. And I do think that some of those things are great because, again, you can't blame it on any one government, but a lot of these sort of non-traditional sanctions, and we've started seeing it, but I think those are the kinds of things that make a difference. As big of a Washington sports fan as I am, you know what I mean? Like maybe Ovechkin and people like that, maybe Russian players don't get their visa next time, you know what I mean? And like I said, I feel blasphemous for saying that as a Capitals fan, but I mean, at the end of the day, you need people like him and others who have influence, who have a voice to really feel it. Now, in some cases, people like that might be able to immigrate or other things, but I do think that that's a way that you actually can get around this, is you do have to have them. And I think the similar thing happened with South Africa. Like, one of the things that really got apartheid to fall was extreme international pressure. Like I said, it matters that people can't go to the Olympics. It matters that people can't participate in the international arena. Even Queen Elizabeth turned her back on them at one point, but that was partly what that international pressure was what, led to end of apartheid. So I completely agree with that.
Well, thank you both so much. It was just an honor to be spending some time with you, learn from your expertise and your experiences. I'm going to hand it back over to Alexa now, but thank you so much, both of you, for participating today.
It was such a pleasure to do this with Danica, and you as well, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Really, on behalf of the network, thank you so much, Danica and Piper and Amy. We really do appreciate you sharing your expertise. How lucky are we to have access to these Changemakers, really fabulous program. Thanks to all of you for attending and for your continued engagement and support. Jolene and I look forward to bringing you more opportunities for engagement with AU and with the network. And there are many, many ways to get involved, and we'll be sure to get those ways out to you so that you continue your engagement. And in case you haven't heard, with a $500 million goal, AU's Change Can't Wait campaign, it's going to create real transformational educational opportunities for our students, advance research with impact, build stronger communities locally, nationally, and globally. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today. And Jolene and I and others look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.